Imagine a city falling asleep on a quiet October night, completely unaware that within hours the world they knew would melt into a storm of fire. Chicago, 1871. Streets of wooden houses, dry winds, a sky so crisp it felt hollow, like something terrible was waiting behind it. No alarms, no warnings, just the ordinary sounds of a Sunday evening. And somewhere on the south side, a lantern was about to tilt. But the strange thing is nobody knows what truly caused the Chicago fire, even today. Historians argue, witnesses contradict each other, and the city's greatest disaster still hides its real beginning in shadows. Some said it was Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern. Others swore it was a group of drunk men gambling in the barn. Some even whispered about a falling meteor or a flaming piece of comet debris igniting the city like tinder. But the truth has never been proven. All we know is this: the spark, whatever it was, fell at the worst possible moment in history. Chicago had been baking for months. No rain, no moisture. The entire city was basically kindling. Almost every home was wood. Roofs, wood, sidewalks, wood. Even the streets were lined with wooden planks. The city was a matchbox waiting for one flick, one careless second to become a nightmare. And that second was coming fast. At around 9 p.m., somewhere in the O'Leary neighborhood, flames flickered to life. Small at first, weak, harmless looking, but the wind that night was unnatural. Survivors would later say it felt alive, as if it knew exactly where to go and what to destroy. The fire didn't spread, no, it leaped, jumping from building to building in seconds. Embers flew like burning insects, landing on rooftops blocks away. People rushed outside, confused, half asleep, staring, as a tiny barn fire suddenly turned into a wall of flame taller than the houses themselves. Panic didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, a few people shouting, a few running. Then the sound changed. The air began to roar. Flames made a deep, hungry noise like breath being sucked through the city. And when the fire reached the first row of closely packed wooden houses, Chicago transformed. It wasn't just burning, it was folding into itself. Windows exploded. Roofs collapsed in showers of sparks. The fire moved faster than horses could run. Families tried to grab what they could: Bible, picture, frame, but most had seconds, not minutes. Mothers screamed for children. Fathers tried to lift burning doors, barehanded. People turned toward the fire department, but it too was overwhelmed. Some of the fire engines were out of service. Water pressure was almost nothing, and the flames were too high, too hot, too fast. Firefighters described the heat as like standing inside a furnace with no walls. But the strangest part, multiple witnesses from different parts of the city reported the same thing: glowing fireballs rolling through the streets. Not sparks, not embers, actual spheres of flame moving with the wind, igniting everything they touched. A phenomenon scientists call fire whirls today. But in 1871, people thought these burning tornadoes were demons ripping through Chicago. By midnight, the fire had grown so monstrous that it created its own weather. The heat was so intense, it pulled oxygen upward, spinning flames into spiraling columns. Winds hit hurricane strength. The firestorm lifted, burning debris thousands of feet into the air and rained it back down across the city. Some pieces flew over the river, igniting areas thought to be safe. Others traveled nearly a mile. And then the unthinkable happened. The Chicago River caught fire. Oil, waste, and industrial runoff, floating on the river's surface, ignited like gasoline. The water turned into a glowing red ribbon, cutting through the darkness. People standing on bridges screamed as flames erupted beneath them, climbing upward like tall, writhing ghosts. The fire wasn't just on land anymore. Chicago was burning from below. The city tried to flee north, toward the supposed fireproof brick and stone buildings, but even they crumbled under the heat. Some structures didn't even catch fire. They simply cracked apart from temperature shock. Telegraph poles detonated. Horses collapsed in the streets. Entire blocks dissolved into ash. In the chaos, there were moments of eerie silence. People standing in the streets, staring up at a sky that looked unreal. A sky glowing orange and red like it was bleeding. The moon vanished behind thick smoke. You couldn't tell day from night. Survivors later said it felt like the apocalypse had arrived. Not metaphorically, literally. One man wrote in his diary, "I saw the sky begin to boil." Another said, "It sounded like 1,000 locomotives screaming at once." Those who tried to outrun the flames described the ground shaking beneath their feet from collapsing buildings. The heat was so intense, it burned people from hundreds of feet away. Clothes ignited just from the air temperature. Some people took refuge in the lake, standing waist-deep in cold water, while flames roared over their heads like a living ceiling. Somewhere in all this, Mrs. O'Lareth, the woman blamed for everything, was hiding in her home, terrified. She later said she didn't even know her barn was burning until the entire neighborhood was already glowing red. Reporters hounded her for years, but she maintained her innocence until the day she died. Today, historians mostly agree she was scapegoated, convenient, easy to blame, but not the cause. Because the truth is, this fire was coming no matter what. The city was too dry, too vulnerable, too unprepared. Whether it was a cow, a spark, a careless cigarette, or something stranger, the result would have been the same. A disaster waiting for the wrong night hand, the wrong wind. And that night had finally arrived. As the flames moved toward the city center, toward the wealthy districts, the churches, the downtown hotels, the river crossings, it became clear that this wasn't going to be just another fire. Chicago wasn't facing destruction, it was facing erasure. And the worst part, the real horror hadn't even begun yet. By the time the sun should have risen over Chicago, there was no sun, only a red, trembling glow behind towers of smoke that stretched miles into the sky. People wandering the streets couldn't tell if it was dawn or if the world was simply burning so brightly that night had no power anymore. The fire, now a living creature, had swallowed the business district and was devouring its way north. Its heat so immense that iron beams curled like paper and marble, cracked into shards. Survivors spoke later of the sound. Not the crackling of wood or the collapse of buildings. Those were small noises compared to the roar that shook the city that morning. It was deeper, heavier, like the earth itself was groaning under the weight of the flames. Some thought it was thunder. Others thought it was the city giving its final breath. But those who were closest to the firestorm said it was something worse. The air itself, vibrating from heat so intense it bent light. People fled any direction they could, but the fire moved like a predator. It chased crowds up streets, cornered them at dead ends, forced them into the lake. Mothers carrying children ran blindly through smoke, so thick they could barely see their own hands. Horses, crazed with terror, broke loose from stables and charged through the chaos, dragging wagons behind them like burning comets. Dogs howled until their voices vanished. Somewhere, church bells rang without anyone touching them. Heat alone melted the metal enough that the clappers swung freely, tolling like a funeral for the entire city. And over it all, embers drifted down like burning snow. On the north side, families thought they had time minutes, maybe hours. But the fire's speed defied logic. One moment the flames were blocks away. The next, roofs burst into fire without a spark ever touching them. People looked up and saw the air shimmering, bending, twisting. It was superheated. Houses didn't catch fire, they ignited from nothing. A man wrote in his memoir years later, "The heat looked invisible until you walked into it. Then it felt like opening an oven door with your face." Across the city, firefighters collapsed from exhaustion. Many hadn't slept in 2 days the night before had seen another major fire, one so big they believed it was the disaster of the year. No one imagined another would erupt within 24 hours, one infinitely worse. Their horses were spent, their hoses melted, their water pressure, what little existed, was useless against a fire this big. They weren't fighting a blaze anymore. They were witnessing a force of nature. Chicago wasn't just burning, it was being rewritten. Somewhere downtown, entire blocks collapsed forward in waves. One brick building folded neatly into another, pushing it over like a giant domino. People standing on the riverbanks saw reflections of flaming buildings falling into the water, sending up clouds of steam that briefly hid the horror, only for the fire to reappear stronger, brighter, hungrier. And then came the fire tornadoes. Witnesses saw them forming thin columns of flame, rising, swirling, collecting debris, growing until they became spinning towers of fire. They lifted roof shingles, fences, even pieces of houses into the sky. One man swore he saw a cow lifted into the air. Another claimed a burning roof landed a quarter-mile away, fully intact. Scientists today confirm that fire whirls during major firestorms can behave exactly like that, miniature tornadoes with the strength of small cyclones. In the wealthy neighborhoods, people refused to believe the fire would reach them. They stood on balconies, staring down at a distant glow, thinking it would stay on the south side where it began. But as the wind shifted, embers shot across the sky like red stars, landing silently at their feet. Curtains caught fire first, then window frames, then the houses themselves, lighting up like lanterns in the approaching dawn. People rushed toward the bridges only to find many had already collapsed or were too hot to cross. Flames licked at the wooden planks, melting tar and sealing off escape routes. Crowds surged forward, desperate, terrified, children screaming as the wind whipped embers into their faces. Some tried crossing anyway and fell through weakened boards into the burning river. No one had expected that the only safe direction might be downward. Some families ran to the shoreline, thinking the lake breeze might protect them. But when they reached it, the smoke rolling off the city formed a gigantic wall. It didn't drift upward, pushed outward, forming a sweeping black sheet that swallowed the beach. People stumbled into the water, coughing, choking, pressing wet cloths to their mouths. A few waded deeper and deeper, some nearly drowning as waves pulled at their clothes. But the alternative was worse. Those who made it far enough offshore watched as the city burned in silence, buildings falling, sparks swirling, the entire horizon glowing orange. One survivor said it looked like a volcano had erupted under the city and we were watching from the crater. Another said he saw a man walking knee-deep into the lake with a blanket over his head, holding a baby above the water as ash fell around them. The firestorm advanced steadily, not like a normal fire, but like a tidor, an invading army. It didn't flicker. It advanced in a solid front, devouring everything. Even stone buildings, once seen as indestructible, cracked under the heat and collapsed inward. The courthouse dome glowed red before falling with a thunderous crash that shook the entire district. Hotels, theaters, and churches gone within minutes. And hidden beneath all this destruction was an even stranger mystery. In the decades after the fire, investigators noticed something odd. Many of the burn patterns didn't match typical fires. Some objects that should have burned survived. Others that should have survived were vaporized. In several areas, patches of wood remained untouched, while nearby metal objects melted. In others, stone walls collapsed outward instead of inward, suggesting sudden pressure, changes like explosions without sound. People reported hearing a deep humming before their homes caught fire. Some said the air around them felt charged, like electricity before lightning. There were letters from soldiers stationed outside Chicago, claiming they saw the sky flash as if a distant cannon had fired. And in one forgotten newspaper clipping, a railroad worker described a streak of light in the sky moments before the fire started. Whether these were hallucinations or fragments of a forgotten truth, no one knows. But what's certain is that the fire behaved like something more than a simple accident. It was a storm, a machine, a force of physics pushed beyond normal limits. By mid-morning, the entire center of Chicago was unrecognizable. The city grid had become a maze of collapsed beams, burning rubble, overturned wagons, charred bodies, and black clouds so thick they turned day into perpetual dusk. The heat distorted the air so badly that distant shapes appeared to sway and ripple. People didn't know which direction to run because even the horizon had lost meaning. And the fire was still spreading. It was heading straight for the north side, the final refuge, the last hope. Thousands of people had gathered there, believing they had outrun the worst of it. But they were about to learn a cruel truth. Once a firestorm begins, there is no outrunning it. No one on the north side knew how little time they had left. They stood along the open fields, clutching their children, their bundles of hastily grabbed belongings, their animals on frayed ropes, thousands of people staring back at a burning city that didn't look real anymore. The flames in the distance rose like a moving mountain, bending and folding, swallowing entire blocks in seconds. Some people prayed, some wept, others went silent, unable to process what they were seeing, because it didn't look like Chicago burning. It looked like the end of the world. The firestorm thundered forward, not gently, not creeping, charging. Embers flew ahead of it like scouts, landing on rooftops, in gardens, on the clothes of the terrified refugees. People slapped at their sleeves, their children's hair, anything that glowed. But the embers didn't fall like the gentle ash of a campfire. They fell as burning fragments of entire houses, carried by winds hotter than furnaces. A man standing near the North Branch River swore he saw a burning timber the size of a horse fly overhead like a blazing comet. Another saw a wagon wheel land in the middle of the field, spinning, still aflame. The wind had become a weapon, sharpened, enraged, alive. And the temperature The temperature was rising by the second. Witnesses described it as a wall of heat, an invisible force pushing in front of the firestorm, blasting the crowd even before the flames reached them. Clothes dried instantly. Hair became brittle. Eyebrows curled. People shielded their faces with blankets. But the fabric grew warm, then hot, then unbearable. A woman collapsed, screaming that her lungs felt like they were burning from the inside. Panic broke the crowd. Families surged toward the riverbanks. Some jumped into the water immediately, splashing, gasping, clutching wooden planks to float. The surface steamed around them. A few tried to swim to the center of the river, but the undercurrent was strong, and their heavy wool clothes dragged them down. Others tried to outrun the fire by heading north toward open grassland, toward farms, toward anything that wasn't burning. But they didn't realize the fire was moving faster than a running horse. Once the firestorm fully engaged, it pulled oxygen toward itself in a massive suction, creating winds up to 70 miles per hour, winds strong enough to knock people off their feet. Some were literally blown backward by the force. Those who remained on land faced a new horror. The wooden sidewalks, Chicago's famous raised planks, had become perfect channels for the fire. Flames shot down them like they were fuse lines, racing ahead faster than anyone could sprint. People trying to use them as escape routes suddenly found fire exploding out from beneath their feet. One survivor remembered seeing the ground glow red like the floor of a blacksmith's forge near the river. Firefighters, exhausted, coughing, mostly defeated, tried a last desperate tactic. They soaked blankets in the river and threw them over anyone who would listen, shouting for people to lie on the ground. But there was no coordination, no leadership, no plan, just survival. And yet, in the chaos, a strange kind of unity formed. Strangers grabbed each other's children. Men lifted elderly women onto their backs. Entire families joined hands to keep from being separated in the smoke. One witness described it as the moment when humanity forgot everything except the instinct to save one another. But instinct could only do so much. When the fire finally reached the north side, it didn't creep in, it detonated. The heat ignited entire rows of houses simultaneously. Windows burst outward. Roofs collapsed inward. Wooden fences flashed white, then fell as ash. The roar grew so loud that people could no longer hear themselves scream. One man later wrote, "I saw the fire leap the river as though it had wings." And he wasn't exaggerating. Witnesses saw flame whirlwinds spinning across the water like fiery spirals, touching down on the opposite shore and exploding into sheets of fire. The North Branch, the last natural barrier, offered no protection at all. Some families raced for the open prairie north of town, believing the fire would have no fuel there. They were wrong again. The wind carried sparks into the tall, dry grass, turning it into a second, separate wildfire. People running for safety found themselves trapped between two advancing fronts, one behind them, one ahead of them. For many, the only refuge left was the lake. Hundreds waded into the icy water, holding onto anything that floated: boards, barrels, doors ripped from houses. Waves pushed them back toward the burning shoreline, so they fought against the pull, coughing and choking as smoke rolled across the water like fog. A child clung to her father's neck as he treaded water for hours, whispering prayers between gasps for air. People who couldn't swim held onto each other, forming chains in the shallows. Some stood with water up to their necks, their faces barely above the surface. Mothers held babies in wet blankets, dipping them under every few seconds to cool their skin. Behind them, the city screamed. They watched from the water as the church steeples fell one by one, as warehouses collapsed in bursts of red sparks, as entire streets vanished under waves of flame. One man said it looked like a beast tearing meat from a carcass. Hours passed like years. Eventually, slowly, painfully, the wind shifted. The fire, having consumed nearly everything combustible, began to weaken. Its roar softened. The sky, once red, faded into a sickly brown. Smoke drifted upward instead of outward, and then silence. People emerged from the lake like ghosts, shivering, shaking, covered in ash. They stepped onto shores that no longer looked like Chicago. The buildings were gone. The streets were gone. Landmarks were gone. What remained was an alien landscape twisted iron, mountains of ash, smoldering stone, faint orange embers glowing like the last breaths of a dying monster. More than 17,000 buildings destroyed, 100,000 people homeless, an entire American city erased in less than 24 hours. But the greatest mystery remained unsolved. How could a fire starting in a barn grow into a storm powerful enough to melt metal, reverse winds, and create tornadoes of flame? How could ordinary wooden homes ignite without a spark ever touching them? Why did some objects that should have burned remain untouched, while others that should have survived were obliterated? Weather alone couldn't explain it. Human error couldn't explain it. Even modern scientists still struggle to explain it fully. Some say it was the perfect convergence of drought, heat, wind, and bad luck. Others quietly suggest something more, something atmospheric, electrical, perhaps even cosmic, something that made the fire behave unlike any other in recorded history. Chicago rebuilt, but the question remains, what really started the Great Chicago Fire? And could the same conditions ever happen again? Because if they did, no modern city, no matter how advanced, could withstand what Chicago faced that night.